about this. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Mike, and we're all so grateful that you stepped up and created a show for us.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate that. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me okay? Needs to be louder?
No, I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, well, I'll speak up, and I've got my mic on. So thank you. How you doing? Nice to see you here.
Great.
Okay, so I'm filling in at the last minute. I have nothing prepared, but I told the board, well, I've been working on palette knife paintings recently. I am entering an invitational, and they wanted to have all new work, and it's jury. So I have been working about the past month, maybe 5 weeks, on trying to create a new body of work that was all palette knife. And so I've done various sizes, from small ones like 12 by 12, 8 by 8, all the way up to 30 by 24. And I would have brought more of those tonight, but they're still wet. I mean, you apply this oil paint, and it's so thick. Some pigments dry faster than others. I don't use any mediums or anything like that. So these are the ones that were dry, and I can't totally vouch for that. So, anyway, we were talking about plein air painting this evening. So this is a new one. It's still got a few little slight wet spots on it, but I'm going to set that there. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Primarily, what I've been doing, actually, since the end of 2020, like the last few months of 2020, I switched up my color palette to a much brighter, more expressionistic palette of colors. And where that came from was Gamblin Oils divides their pigments into 3 categories. And the first category is Old Masters or Renaissance. The second category is Impressionism. And the third category is Modern. So all the colors that I was using came from the Modern color palette from Gamblin, and you can find that online. And they're just much brighter, as you might suspect. The Old Masters, they're more somber. There's a whole variety of colors, but they're all more somber. That's the best word I can say for them. I don't want to call them dull, but they're just more somber. The Impressionists get a little brighter, and we see a few more varieties of pigments and a little brighter colors. But when you get into the Modern, you really get into the crazy stuff. So it's more what the Expressionists were using. And I've heard that Expressionists used Prussian blue instead of ultramarine. So it's kind of like that switch in color palette. And all the colors basically in that Modern category are just fun. And so I just started concentrating on those in the studio, doing studio work. And I like the results, but I had wondered because I do a lot of plein air painting with Missouri Plein Air Painters. And of course, it's more of a traditional approach where you use basically 3 or 4 colors, limited palette, and it's the cadmium red and yellow and blue and ultramarine blue and white. And some people vary it a little bit, or they'll use a Zorn palette, which is a limited color palette. So I wasn't quite sure how I was going to be received when I took these Expressionist colors out in the field. And so the first painting I did was probably in April with the group. We had been not meeting because of COVID, but then we started going back out in April of 2021. So the very first painting I did, it was kind of like a day like today where there's not much color, was in a park, Beatree Park, and it was all this kind of like gray color. But so I pulled these colors out, and anything that was gray, like the tree trunks or whatever, I just assigned a color to it. So I made them blue. And all the green in this painting were leaves, and so they were all dead. So they were all like rusty brown and really pretty colors, but that's not what I was after here. And the orange path was mud, basically, and very gray. And of course the water, this is the Mississippi River, was kind of a muddy green color. And anyway, just total not what you would call, I guess I would say unexpected or not conventional anyway, in any way of representing a landscape. And To my surprise, everybody loved it. So all my plein air painter friends, I thought they were gonna like throw me out. But anyway, so one of them said, you know, that's gonna look great in a frame. So I've never had it in a frame, but I think it probably would look nice in a plein air frame. And so I just kept at it. And there's some more examples up here that you can see. This is one that I did later in the summer at Cliff Cave Park. This was all plein air on my easel. You know, bizarre colors, but what I was trying to do is just push it. And that was what I'm all about there. And here's another one from Cliff Cave Park. There's an old house there. I thought that it's a big old mansion that has these real peaked roofs and everything. I thought it looked like a storybook, especially done up in these colors. So I think I've had this one here before, so y'all have seen it. And then this was another one from Cliff Cave. Again, just a lot of unconventional colors with some wildflowers in the foreground. And not trying to do or copy what I would call local color, which is the colors that you see out there, but just being more inventive, trying to be more inventive and not worrying about trying to copy local color. And so from there, like I said, I was trying to build this body of work that I could enter in this invitational. It is juried, so I'm not sure if anything's going to be accepted, but I wanted to have kind of a body of work that would hang together. So I think I entered like 7 paintings, and a couple of these are in the entry. This one is, and I thought this one would be a good one to talk about because my approach to palette knife painting is to look for simple shapes, interesting shapes, and try to compose a composition made up of simple shapes and yet have it read as something, and in this case it's architecture, buildings, and perspective. And the way I arrive at this color palette and this composition is I subscribe to a stock image service. I actually have 2. I have a subscription and I have an account with one. And if I'm looking for something, if I'm looking for an image to render all these paintings, whether on the easel and that one that I just had in my hand, are taken from photographs. And I don't like to copy a photograph, but I do buy the rights to an image either through Shutterstock, which is a monthly subscription, and I can get 10 images per month at for the basic fee, and the fee is $29. So I get 10 images for $29 a month, and I use that not just for painting, but I use it for commercial work as well. So I kind of have to have it for that business. But I also have an account with Shutterstock, and you don't have to buy a monthly fee. You can just buy the images individually, and they're $9 a piece. So it's not terribly expensive, especially if you find something that works. And what I look for is images that I think they're colorful and fun, and sometimes maybe a little off color, maybe dull or whatever, that I can brighten up digitally. And so the painting that I'm working on tonight, actually started painting on it today. I prepared the canvas last week, and I did the sketch on the canvas, and I'll show you that in a minute. But it came from an image, this is the picture, and it was a picture of a swap meet. And I had these big umbrellas in the foreground. I don't know if you can't really see them from back there. Let me hold this right here. Anyway, I cropped the image and made that overhanging umbrella a lot bigger, and created a composition, and then I enhanced it, saturated the colors, and actually shifted a few colors in a couple spots to get what I wanted to kind of improve the composition and color balance. And then there's a setting in Photoshop where you can simplify it. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called cutout. And you can adjust it to get the shapes simpler till they're almost abstract. And all of those look great to me, but I try to keep it so it's a little bit recognizable. So this is what I'm going to be painting from. But I do paint from photographs, and especially all this new work that I've done. All of those came from photographs. I worked with a palette knife last Sunday when we were plein air painting. Susan and I were painting with Missouri plein air painters, and It's a little more difficult out in the field. It's a little time consuming, but I did work with it, and I did a big thing of water, and I was going to bring it tonight, but it's still wet. So anyway, that's how I arrive at these things, and so I'm going to keep this by me. I just wanted to point out a couple other tools that I use for plein air painting, and carries it around in my bag wherever I go. First, this is a value finder. You can look at a scene and see where the darks and lights are. Susan, I know you have one of these, right? Carol Carter sold those at her workshop. I also use a composition finder, which is nice because you can adjust that little window to whatever size your painting is, and so you have the right proportions, and you can look through it and then kind of find a composition. I also carry with me a couple different color wheels that I refer to sometimes if I'm really disciplined, and this is let's see, whatever the one is. I think it's not a tetra. Can't remember the terminology, but it's got the four corners, and so I work with everything in the range of that. This is especially when I was doing plein air in those bright colors. And then this is more of a complement or split complement, so I mark it off. And then the colors I use, if I don't have it in my painting, I go in my paint box and try to find the color and match it to that. So I have a gamut, and a person who describes this really well is, on his website, is James Gurney. And if you know him, he is a fantastic artist and illustrator. He's done some books, but his information is great, and especially when he gets into color gamut, he's very knowledgeable about it. And he painted a painting off this color palette, painted a painting off this color palette. They look totally different, but it's totally same subject. Amazing the variations you can get. And then I always carry a little color wheel like this that I can kind of, if I need to, I can rotate it around and find what complements are, and you know, set it as a guide on the back. That you can't really see it too well, but all those boxes and triangles and everything indicate what your color palette is. There's a term for it in each one, and it's a nice way to get a balance in your painting. So that's what I've been doing on that. And so let's, as I say, I started a painting today, and I'm going to work on it. I don't know that I'm going to get it finished this evening, but let me bring this over. So I painted the canvas this orange color. It's called pimento, and I just did that because I wanted to kill the white. I wanted to have a colorful base. You'll see artists out in the field that do this. Sometimes they use, I think one artist that we know, Sarah Lawrence, uses like a pink. I was using a raw sienna the other day, but what it does is it kills the white. Now this pimento is kind of an odd color, but it's, you know, the paint, when you put the paints on it, they seem to hang together on it. And actually the reason I was using it is because I had it left over from that mural project, and I got all these paint cans that I gotta use up. So what I did was I tinted that, or just painted it that pimento color. So that's the base color that I'm working with, and then I started to fill in the darkest squares. And there's all kinds of ways you can work when you work with oil paintings. You can work from dark to light. You can work from mid-tones to light tones, and then go back and forth between the dark tones and so on. So this one, though, what I found is that it's better to start with the dark tones. What I have been more success with is just starting with the darks. And so this first combination of colors, the dark is dioxazine purple and a little bit of cadmium orange. And I put it on kind of thin, so some of that orange shows through the actual paint. And you can see that if you come up close and look on these in this area here, there's some of that. So I like the way that looks. You know, I'm just started out with that, and like I say, I don't think I'm going to finish this evening, but I'll just put on a few applications of color and just show you the different ways that I work with that and the palette type. And we're kind of dim up here, but that's so we can keep it brighter on the screen up there. So if I'm in your way, because I'm going to stand right about in here, and you want to move down to that side, you can, or you know, wherever. Move so you can see it. It won't bother me. And I'll just get started. one of the other things that I've been working with and that I really like are paint sticks. Have you ever tried these? These are oil sticks. Now, they're called R&E Pigment Sticks. And this color I'm going to use is King's Blue, and it's going to be my sky. And my fingers are going to get dirty. I'm afraid. I brought some gloves. There they go. Here we are. Anyway, this is a great product. It gets paint on the canvas fast. Let me put on my gloves.
I think it's R and F.
R and F? Okay, thank you. R and F. I'll put on my timer. So I'm gonna go over. So I'm gonna put on some gloves because otherwise my hands are really get messy. This gets messy.
Hey, Michael, can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
And I apologize for the artists in here that know this stuff, and this is a very basic question. I find this really fascinating, but can you explain, with color wheels, when you take those things out, are you looking for complementary colors, colors that go well together, or colors that maybe are opposites? What are you using with color wheels?
Now that I have my glasses on, I can tell you. This is called a triad, and there's a triad and a tetrad, which is the 4, and then complements and split complements. This is a triad, and because it's a little wider, and you can rotate that triangle around the wheel, you point it in any direction, and you'll get inside the triangle, you'll get a gamut of colors. And again, I recommend James Gurney for this because he explains it really well, much better than I can. But I just kept this in my easel for reference so that if the painting was missing a color that was inside that triangle, I would go find it and put it in there. And even if it wasn't there, just to make the painting have balance.
So that, yeah, the balance is the colors that work well together, is that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So, you know, it's a tetrad, a triad, a complement, and a split complement. Those are the 4, and you can change that around the wheel and pick up different colors. And this in particular, this tetrad, I was working with blue violet, red violet, yellow orange, and yellow green. And you know, the range of colors within that box, and the kind of the chroma, the value and everything is what I was going for.
And one other question too, you purchase stock photography at times to use.
Yes.
Do you carry a camera with you, or you're on your phone, and you see things and say, there's something I need to take a picture of?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. I do some of my paintings are from my own photographs, like iPhone photographs. I'm not a photographer, but I see compositions, like especially when there's strong light, strong shadows. That's what interests me are just those kind of almost abstraction kind of shapes, and I don't know. I just think it's interesting. So yeah, thanks for the question. Hope that helped.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So R and F paint stick. So I'm going to use this for the sky. So here's the way it goes on. You just put it on like
chapstick.
Yeah, like chapstick. And depending upon the surface you're working on and kind of how your picture is holding up, your canvas is holding up, and your markers or your paint applicator is holding up, or the stick is holding up, you'll get a nice, even I really like working this because it's so quick. It just gets coverage on there so quickly and nice and even. I don't mind if some of that orange shows through, some of that pimento shows through.
How long does it take to go through a tube of it?
Well,
Stick of it, whatever it's called.
it goes pretty far. I've had this for a while, and that's what I got left. So, then I put some on my palette, so in case I need it, I can pick up some. And it thins with thinner, and I'm using low odor thinner, and it's green, supposedly green. If you know what I mean. Good for the environment, better than turpentine. So, you know, that was real quick, and that got that kind of shape outlined, and so I'm very happy with that. And I'm going to put some darker values in this zone right here, but I think what I also want to do now is kind of establish these midtones down here at the bottom, which would be the ground. And so for that, I'm probably going to use a color, a neutral color, like, if I can find it. I carry all this with me wherever I go. This is my studio right here, so I can rummage around in here, sorry. Sometimes on these initial washes, I'll use a fast mat. Gamblin makes that, and it's a quick drying oil. So you can put down a thin wash, like for these dark areas, a thin wash, and it'll dry more quickly. So because you want to paint over stuff, and that's always a problem with oil, is that whatever you paint over kind of picks it up, and when you use the fast mat, it's like a good initial coat. So I have this neutral gray. It's a neutral gray, a Gamblin 1980, that's kind of their inexpensive line, but I'll just use a little bit of that, and I'll start putting that on with a knife. I'd like to warm that up a little bit, so I'm going to put a little bit of another Gamblin color, gold ochre, a little yellow ochre with that. So I'm going to mix that with the knife, and then a little bit of white. And I'm using a Winsor Newton Winton inexpensive white paint. I don't need much, but I like these big tubes because I like to use a lot of paint. So, I've got a variety of knives that I use, or I have in the studio anyway. I won't say that I use them all, but this one I use a lot, and my other favorite one is not in this group, but you know, small helps for little details. Little details. And I don't see my big knife, but it's in here. Yeah. This one, which is a little more unusual, but you can find them, it's just squared off. It's got a squared off end. It's really nice for edges and like certain little details and so on. So I use this one a lot. I'm going to mix this up. Gray in there. Just trying to make kind of a neutral tan color. It might be kind of like sand or kind of washed out asphalt or whatever you want to call it. A ground plane. And it's a little lighter value. Yeah. I recently saw a video of the artist Susan Rothenberg. I don't know if you know her work or not, but she's very well known for her sculptures and paintings of horses. And it was a kind of an extended segment, and she was talking about her new paintings, which are pretty, I mean, they're representational, but they're pretty abstract. They're kind of variations on still lifes, but lots of big abstract shapes and so on. But one thing she was talking about was that she was really attracted to it, and then I got the bug, was dirty whites. So I noticed that the art museum has a new Picasso painting on display, and the background is almost all dirty white. And so I've been trying to come up with dirty whites as kind of my, top value, highest value. And so a lot of these have dirty white in them. They almost look pure white, but they're not really. It's like a off-white, and she uses it quite extensively, and I thought that was real interesting. So I've been trying to. I think about that often. So this is kind of a dirty white. So I'm just going to lay this in here. And one thing about this palette knife technique is that it does force you to be loose.
Is it a flat tip?
It is. It is. It's a flat painting knife. And for now, I'm not going to be too worried about coverage, because I can always go back and correct it once I get it on the canvas.
Correct it, meaning move it around with
Well,
some other knife or a brush or?
maybe. Yes, I like to have the edges kind of neat and be, sharp in spots.
Mhm.
So yes, sometimes you have to go over it a couple times to get what you need. Or what you're going for. I'd have to say also that a lot of times I have something in mind that I'm going for, and that never turns out. So I think that happens when you're painting. You're just kind of hoping for the best a lot of times. The other thing I found is when you put the knife on there and you kind of pull the paint away, you get some, especially if it mixes with another color, you get some real interesting effects. And so I try not to be too rigorous in the coverage and everything, because I think sometimes when you get those mixes, it becomes a little more interesting.
Mm. I was gonna ask, what's the attraction to using a knife as opposed to paintbrushes?
Yeah, I think the thickness of the paint, for one, the kind of the troweled-on effect of the texture, the surface that you get, is a little different from a brush. Now this one here, I used a great big old fan brush for one big stroke across the top of the canvas. But I'm always looking for different surfaces, and this does give you a little different surface. It keeps it loose, and again, I'm just trying for big shapes. So if you get in there with a brush, sometimes you start to like model it and so on. So by sticking to the knife, you really can't. You can do it, but you start to overwork it, and so it just keeps it fresher, I think, or at least that's been my experience. I know it's always tempting to go back and start mixing things up and getting more what conventional look, but if you can kind of keep the shapes interesting, and I've got this nice orange funky color background, but when you start to cover it up and you just see little bits of it, it's not quite as overpowering, and it's a little more fun.
So since you probably won't get it done tonight, will you bring it back next month so we can see it
Sure.
finished?
Sure, hopefully it'll be dry.
It'll be in the monthly art critique.
Mike, do you ever use alkalids?
Use what?
Alkylate oils?
No, I haven't. Do you like those?
I've been painting with them for 30 years.
Is that right?
I love them.
Well, what's the difference?
They dry almost within 12 hours, where you can go back.
Yeah.
And paint over.
Paint over it,
And
yeah.
they're oils.
Oh, wow. And do they, one thing I do like about oils and working with a knife is that you can get like some real thick textures and so on.
Yes.
I
They're
noticed
very
that
thick
when
paint.
I worked with acrylic, they kind of flatten out. You can work, they'll seem real thick when you put them on
They
there.
hold their body.
Yeah, oh, well, that's interesting. I'll give them a shot. That sounds good. I like the idea that it dries quicker.
Yeah, it's $6 tube from Acrylics.
That's
At least it was, it might have gone up since.
Yeah, probably have gone up, but, all art supplies have gone up, and they're also, like these paint sticks, there's not much stock left on them. So I don't know if they're gonna replenish their stock or not, but, they're kind of a supply chain thing, I think.
Mike, I just kind of realized this, but your fast matte paints that you're using,
Yes?
those are, what Ed's talking about, that Alkyd.
Oh, is that what they are?
Uh-huh,
Oh, okay,
yeah, so you do use them.
yeah. Well, Gamblin calls them fast matte, and I had one out here, we can look at the tube, but, yes, there is a really nice, advantage to a quicker drying oil. And I found that out recently, I've got like 4 or 5 paintings just sitting there waiting I go touch them every day and they're still wet.
I do a lot of layers. That's one of the reasons I switched over to the Acrylics. It's easier to do layers every day.
Yeah,
Instead
and
of
so when
waiting
you,
for it to
when you
dry.
do your layers, do you like washes of layers?
I'll do them with dry brush, or I'll do them with thin down paint.
That's interesting.
Now what happens after you've covered up all your drawing?
Well, I try to leave a little drawing so I have some guidelines to go by, but, yes, that's a problem too. Of course, I do have this little reference, that I can always look at, so.
Hey, Michael, how long have you been painting, and what was your background? Did you have formal education in oils?
Yeah, I studied at, SIU Edwardsville about 100 years ago. I graduated. And,
Just 75.
After graduation, we started a family. I got a house, all the things you do in life, and I gave up painting for many years. But I always kept a sketchbook, and if we travel or do something, or if I was like hanging out someplace, I always kept a sketchbook with me. So kept my hand in through sketchbooks, and once my kids were grown up and they didn't need me so much, I started to work in pastels, and I really started that in about 2004. And so 2004 I was working in pastels, and I got real lucky. I had a show. I did a show at Borders, and then I met a designer, and he gave me a show in his place, and that was a big success. Those were pastels mainly, and then I felt like when I was working with pastels that I have that stick, that those pigments in my fingers, and I thought, I'd really like to be using a paintbrush. And so I put down the pastels for a long time, and I would go back to it eventually, every once in a while. But then I started working with brush, and then I did watercolors, and then again kept sketching all this time, doing urban sketching and so on. And then I got into digital work professionally, and what I found there was that the art training bled over into the digital, helped me in the digital part, because I'm not really all that technically advanced, but I know how to work the brushes and all that stuff in the digital world, which is kind of a metaphor really for real painting, I guess. But it's provided a good career for me, and through that and balancing that work with painting and drawing and urban sketching and so on, I just started doing more and more painting. And then I met up with Missouri Plein Air Painters, and Dave Cornell, who has passed away last year, and his son, Sean, a lot of you know him. I just glommed onto them, and I saw them working one day in the Missouri Botanical Garden. I thought, that is really cool. And so I met up with, little did I know, Dave was a member of this organization. I met Dave here, and I realized that's what I was looking at when I was in the Botanical Garden. So I just started showing up wherever they went on Sundays. They paint on Sunday mornings, and I've been doing that for years. We stopped during the pandemic, but still, they're back at it, and so Susan goes, and Marty Coulter, and I haven't seen him in a while, but you know, there's a kind of a solid group that comes in through, rotates in and out, but they're there at one time or another. Debbie Williams was there sometimes too, is there sometimes too. So it's kind of a way of staying in touch with just a group of artists that have similar interests. So that's kind of like my whole kind of history in a nutshell right there. I started this different color palette, like I mentioned, like at the end of 2020, and then I started entering juried shows and you know, got into accepted more things. Probably because that painting might have been a little better than my plein air painting, because the plein air is like really hard, and you know, a lot of people are much better at it than I am, like maybe Susan. And but anyway, I still like plein air, and I go whenever I can. So back to this painting here. Where are we? Well, I've put on the kind of that lighter color, so I'd like to go back and now maybe do some of that umbrella at the top. I go through lots of paper towels.
Don't forget you did the ultimate plein air painting last summer, right?
The ultimate, oh, you mean the mural?
Mural.
Yeah, well, that was a real lucky thing. I got to do one of the Belleville mural projects, and you know, it's a big thing, but it's a little different way of working. I had helpers, and it was a lot of fun to do. Doing a big wall, doing a big mural is a lot different than concentrating on something small like this. And I had help, you know, I had like 4 or 5 helpers, so it's a little different thing. All right, so underneath this umbrella, there are some darker and lighter colors, more like a red-orange. So I'm going to lay that in there. I've got a little orange out, and I should have some brighter red. I'm going to use the brightest red of all, cadmium red light. But I'm going to tone it down a bit.
How many different shapes of palette knives do you have?
Well, right here I have 3, 4, 5. I have 5, but there are others. And if you're doing something really big, you do something like that, which is more like a trowel. But the 2 that I use mostly are that square one and this one here, which is more of a medium size, and get down. Today I was, knowing that I was coming here, this knife had broken off, like so it had a real sharp point on it, but I took it out and I ground it on the concrete, so it kind of came up with a rounded, like a rounded shape. It did work, and it, you know, so I have this little point. I haven't tried to use it yet, but so it's a much better shape. So maybe I can use it for some of these smaller. I'll use it right now. We'll just see how it works. So that's right here. Oh, it's almost like the orange.
Mike, could you use a palette knife on acrylics?
Yes, you definitely could. And there are artists that do. As I mentioned before, my experience with acrylics is unless you add some sort of a medium to the actual paint, even if it's a heavy body acrylic, to get a really thick texture and for it to remain, you really need to add, I think, some kind of a medium to it, like a modeling paste or something like that, so it'll hold its brush stroke and shapes after it dries. My experience with acrylic paint is that they tend to flatten. I like thick brush strokes and so on, but they tend to flatten when they dry. So then there's also a very dark passage underneath that umbrella, so I'm going to fill that in. Mix it with a little bit of red, so it's not just total black, but.
Do you feel you have to be much more dexterous with your hand? Is that the, I don't know if that's the right term.
No, I don't, you know, it's the same thing with a paintbrush, you know, I mean, try to be very controlled and careful with your brush, but, I think this has just as much, flexibility and so on as the brush. And like I say, I like to use a very thick paint application anyway, even if I'm painting with brushes. And let's see.
Mike, do you have any advice on how to load your palette knife? I noticed you had it on both sides of the knife.
Yes, that's a good question. Depending upon where you're working, you might want to scrape it off so that the paint collects on this edge. I don't know if you can see that or not, but depending on what edge you're going up to, you might want to load that side of the knife. So like here, for example, which I just did. Just to fill in that little edge. And same thing here. Remember, this was a paint stick that I applied to the left on the palette. So I can get a nice crisp edge with that. Yeah, this little knife works pretty good, guys. They do come in various sizes, and this is one of the smaller ones, but that really helped that shape. Just kind of made that shape a little more interesting. And that's one big shape. And then I want to do a blue up in the actual umbrella where the sun is hitting the umbrella, but I don't want to do any blue that I've used before, so I'm going to use a cerulean blue. This is a Gamblin 1980 blue. Cerulean, and 1980 is their bargain line. And then I'm going to use a Gamblin Radiant Turquoise, which is again from the modern color palette, and it's very high up on the value scale. So I'll modify this cerulean with that radiant blue. And maybe a little white. it gets mixed up a little bit. So.
Are you just grabbing a little bit of each paint and then kind
I-
of mix it on the?
Yes, I just put a little bit of white in this almost straight cerulean, because I wanna lighten it up as I go towards the, this zone right here, so this is a little darker. Because when I put the brilliant blue in there, it will definitely give an indication that there's sunlight falling on it. And it's also a little different from the paint stick blue that I put on there, and that's also a little different from the ultramarine blue. The other thing about putting the paint thickly on like this, you can create lines with like the point of your knife. In other words, if I wanted to put like a little, line in there, you can do that with a knife. I don't really want to do that, but that was a little demo. So that looks pretty good. And I keep pushing it over to that zone. And then I'm going to use some of this radiant blue and mix a little bit of that with that cerulean and squirt out a bunch of it there. And I'm even going to clean off the knife. I'm just going to leave some pigment on there and pick up some of this radiant blue and just start mixing it in. There's kind of I would call it a ridge or a strut that's holding up the umbrella. And so that's what we kind of want to indicate, that there's, the sunlight is catching that. On that edge. And right up against that red orange that I put down there. And then sometimes you have to clean your knife off because you might pick up an adjacent color that you don't want to see. And then just put down a fresh application of paint over that. Stuck my finger in it. So you get something like that. And then so that mess I made. Blue paint on it. All right, and then start mixing this. I'll put a little more white. I used Winton titanium white there, but I also have a little tube here of Williamsburg titanium white. Williamsburg paints are very expensive, but I bought a few of them to use, and I probably won't buy any more just because they're too expensive, but they're very nice paint. They're owned by Golden Acrylics. Golden purchased them a couple years ago, and they kept the Williamsburg name, but that's manufacturer. last one is gonna be a little lighter. I'm also gonna put a little bit of that khaki color, or whatever you wanna call it, that gray we mixed up, and just kinda dirty up this blue a little bit, and we'll make it a little greener.
Do you normally stand when you're painting?
I do, even in the studio. And especially outside when I'm painting. Even if a little bit of that orange shows through, I'm not too concerned about it. I kinda like that, actually. So you see some little specks of the ground color, especially in the lighter color areas. I probably will leave that, just because I like the way that looks. If I'm working on a bigger canvas, I usually put out much more paint than what I'm doing here, but you know, since I'm working kind of small and so on, I just wanted to use smaller amounts. Take some of that gold color, that gold ochre, and mix it a little bit with ultramarine, and see if I can come up with a little bit of a greenish tint, I guess you'd call it. Maybe more of a tone, which is a little darker, of course. But I'll put some white in there. Just an odd kind of greenish color that will hopefully be interesting on this. It looks like that khaki. that's kind of interesting, but what I would like to see is something a little more interesting. So I have this a little bit of radiant green left, so I'm gonna put some radiant green right in that spot. And hopefully it'll give me a highlight that would be pleasing to the eye. You can see, here it is. If you can put it down and leave it alone, you're better off. Otherwise it starts to look overworked and so on, so. That is a little better. And then I want to mix up one of those dirty whites. Because I got a few whites to put on there. And I've got about 8 minutes, so we'll see what we can do here.
Now, how will you transport this wet piece?
I have a wet carry box, which is that wooden box right there. And as long as you put it in there on the shelf and carry it flat, you're okay. That's what I do with my plein air painting. You can come up and look at it. I've got about, it's like
I'll take a look at it.
I have a whole big number of paintings that I carry around there all the time. So I'm going with the Williamsburg white, the expensive stuff. Although I wouldn't have to. And I want to go back to that neutral gray that I got out. I'm going to put some of that in there. Maybe put some of that yellow ochre in there. And then maybe pick up a little blue. Anything to keep it from being total white. It still has a very high value, but it's not totally white either. So that was kind of an edge on the umbrella, and then there's some tent tops down here. You know who used to do this with such a steady hand was Dave Cornell. He showed me how I did it one time, but I was never able to replicate it. I'm too shaky. He could get the most detail into a little, 4x6 painting or an 8x10.
I was lucky enough to pick up a couple of his smaller pieces at the auction we had
Yeah.
some years ago.
Sure. Well, he had a technique. He would rest his pinky finger on the edge of the canvas that he was painting on, and then he'd hold his paintbrush here, but he would rest his hand in his all the steadiness was absorbed by the pinky on the edge of the canvas. Well, it's like eating with chopsticks. I cannot do that. I said, Dave, how do you do that? And he goes, here, I'll show you. And I go, okay. So, as soon as I tried it, I realized that it was not as easy as he made it look. Pretty whites. Ever since I heard that artist say that, I've been fascinated by it. Now, what I would do is probably put out some more of that blue paint stick on my palette and then go around and kind of clean up these edges with those white marks, or white shapes, I should say. And then the rest of it is just more smaller, refined shapes, and some of those are just going to be dabbed on with the brush. And I'll just put out a little bit of color of each that I need. And it looks like there's maybe, there's some yellow in there. And so this painting has some blue, it has some green, has some orange, but it needs some yellow, it needs some red, it needs a few other little colors to make it really sing. So that's where I'll take it, and I think I'll probably just leave it here at this point. I set out for 50 minutes, I have 3 minutes left, so I think I'll stop, but you guys can come up and look at all this stuff, and I'll leave these plein air paintings out, and you can take a closer look.
And you'll bring it back next month so we can see it finished?
I shall.
Thank you.
I'll put it in a frame and bring it back. I'll put it in a frame.
Thank
Yeah, or
you.
at least put it on Facebook.
Yeah, oh yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, if we had any pictures from the night, we'll put them on Facebook too, right?
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope that was something happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here. That's the main thing.
It was great, thank you.
Thank
And
you.
a lot of times we do have the presenter guess the number for the attendance prize, so do you want to tell